HarperCollins presents J.R.R. Tolkien, Author of the Century, by Tom Shippey. Read by Colin Mace. Foreword. Author of the Century. Fantasy and the fantastic. The dominant literary mode of the 20th century has been the fantastic. This may appear a surprising claim, which would not have seemed even remotely conceivable at the start of the century, and which is bound to encounter fierce resistance even now. However, when the time comes to look back at the century, it seems very likely that future literary historians detached from the squabbles of our present will see as its most representative and distinctive works books like J.R.R. Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings, and also George Orwell's 1984 and Animal Farm, William Golding's Lord of the Flies and The Inheritors, Kurt Vonnegut's Slaughterhouse-Five and Cat's Cradle, Ursula Le Guin's The Left Hand of Darkness and The Dispossessed, Thomas Pynchon's The Crying of Lot 49 and Gravity's Rainbow. The list could readily be extended back to the late 19th century with H.G. Wells's The Island of Dr. Moreau and The War of the Worlds, and up to writers currently active like Stephen R. Donaldson and George R.R. Martin. It could take in authors as different, not to say opposed, as Kingsley and Martin Amis, Anthony Burgess, Stephen King, Terry Pratchett, Don DeLillo and Julian Barnes. By the end of the century, even authors deeply committed to the realist novel have often found themselves unable to resist the gravitational pull of the fantastic as a literary mode. This is not the same, one should note, as fantasy as a literary genre. Of the authors listed above, only 4 besides Tolkien would find their works regularly placed on the fantasy shelves of bookshops, and the fantastic includes many genres besides fantasy: allegory and parable, fairy tale, horror and science fiction, modern ghost story and medieval romance. Nevertheless, the point remains. Those authors of the 20th century who have spoken most powerfully to and for their contemporaries have for some reason found it necessary to use the metaphoric mode of fantasy, to write about worlds and creatures which we know do not exist, whether Tolkien's Middle-earth, Orwell's Ingsoc, the remote islands of Golding and Wells, or the Martians and Tralfamadorians who burst into peaceful English or American suburbia in Wells and Vonnegut. A ready explanation for this phenomenon is, of course, that it represents a kind of literary disease, whose sufferers, the millions of readers of fantasy, should be scorned, pitied, or rehabilitated back to correct and proper taste. Commonly, the disease is said to be escapism. Readers and writers of fantasy are fleeing from reality. The problem with this is that so many of the originators of the later 20th century fantastic mode, including all 4 of those first mentioned before, Tolkien, Orwell, Golding, Vonnegut, are combat veterans, present at or at least deeply involved in the most traumatically significant events of the century, such as the Battle of the Somme, Tolkien, the bombing of Dresden, Vonnegut, the rise and early victory of fascism, Orwell. Nor can anyone say that they turned their backs on these events. Rather, they had to find some way of communicating and commenting on them. It is strange that this had, for some reason, in so many cases, to involve fantasy as well as realism, but that is what has happened. The continuing appeal of Tolkien's fantasy, completely unexpected and completely unpredictable though it was, cannot then be seen as a mere freak of popular taste, to be dismissed or ignored by those sufficiently well-educated to know better. It deserves an explanation and a defense, which this audiobook tries to supply. In the process, I argue that his continuing appeal rests not on mere charm or strangeness, though both are there, and can again, to some extent, be explained, but on a deeply serious response to what will be seen in the end as the major issues of his century: the origin and nature of evil, an eternal issue, but one in Tolkien's lifetime terribly refocused; human existence in Middle-earth without the support of divine revelation; cultural relativity and the corruptions and continuities of language. These are themes which no one can afford to despise or need be ashamed of studying. It is true that Tolkien's answers will not appeal to everyone, and are wildly at odds with those given even by many of his contemporaries, as listed before.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?